seminar on race and the Middle East/North Africa. I first want to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation for supporting groundbreaking research like this. And I want to recognize Beth Barron, who is a distinguished professor of history here at the Graduate Center. And additionally, she serves as the director of the Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center. Her research on gender, history of medicine, and on childhood in Egypt and the Middle East have reframed and deepened our understanding of that region. It's also my pleasure to offer a warm CUNY welcome to the distinguished scholars who are joining us today, Elise Burton, Troutt, Powell, and Dorothy Roberts. From its founding about 60 years ago, the Graduate Center at the City University of New York has promoted a deeper understanding of global issues. Our research institutes, such as the Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center, bring together students and faculty from multiple disciplines and from around the world to advance knowledge and promote cooperation. The Mellon Sawyer Seminar exemplifies the interdisciplinary scholarship that is foundational not only to research at the Graduate Center, but also to our doctoral and master's degree programs, from earth and environmental sciences to urban education to international migration studies. Interdisciplinarity is also a central theme of the scientific research we do here at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center. This particular discussion provides all of us an opportunity to explore the intersections between science, history, and society. So I want to thank you all for joining us for today's seminar, Genetic Crossroads, the Middle East and the Science of Human Heredity. I hope you enjoy the event and the conversations that will follow. Back to you.
And actually, President Garrell, I should have mentioned for the audience, I was so busy introducing myself, and then that Professor Garrell herself is a distinguished scientist and an academic leader committed to higher education and advancing of diversity. She earned a PhD in macromolecular science and engineering from University of Michigan and came to the Graduate Center from work as Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Dean at the Graduate Division of UCLA. She's also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Society for Applied Spectroscopy. Since I'm now doing, since this is a talk in history of science and medicine, I think it was very nice to have you with us and to applaud your work in science as well. So what I would now like to do is introduce our speakers or our conversation partners. Elise Burton is author of Genetics Crossroads. She is an assistant professor in the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. A historian of science and society in the modern Middle East, Burton's primary research interests are race, ethnicity, and nationalism, the history of genetics and evolutionary biology, and transnational scientific collaboration. Before joining the faculty at Toronto, Burton held a junior research fellowship at the University of Cambridge. Dorothy Roberts is an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and law, and the University of Pennsylvania's 14th Integrates Knowledge Professor with joint appointments in the Departments of Africana Studies and Sociology and the Law School, where she holds the inaugural Mosul Alexander Chair. She is also founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society and the Center for Africana Studies. Her books include Fatal Intervention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. She's the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as co-editor of 6 books on topics such as constitutional law and women and the law. Troutt Powell is a distinguished professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a historian of the modern Middle East, focusing on Egypt, Sudan, and the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. Her works illuminate questions of race and slavery at the juncture of Arab and African societies. And her publications include A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of the Sudan, Tell This in My Memory, Stories of Enslavement in Egypt, Sudan, and the Late Ottoman Empire, and the co-edited volume, The African Diaspora in the Mediterranean Lands of Islam. She was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow in 2003 and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. Troutt Powell is the president-elect of the Middle East Studies Association. So I now turn it over to Elise, who will get us started, and then to her discussants. So thank you very much.
I thank you so much, Beth, and everyone who worked to organize this event, and so much thank you to Dorothy Roberts and Troutt Powell for being here, and all of you. This is an outstanding audience, so I'm really excited to have a discussion about the book. And so with that in mind, I didn't prepare, a really detailed summary of the book. I thought I'd start off by just sharing some reflections on what actually inspired me to write this book, the process of research and writing, and how my ideas about this project changed over time during that process. So this project, like I think many historical projects, begin backward. So I started with an interest actually in contemporary genetics, or more or less contemporary, because already we're talking about 10 to 15 years ago when I was an undergraduate at the University of California at Berkeley. And at Berkeley, I was a major in Middle Eastern studies. I was learning modern Middle Eastern languages and history, especially as is so prominent. Those of us know of histories of nationalism in the modern Middle East. At the same time, I was also a biology major. So I was working in laboratories, I was sequencing DNA, and I was studying genetics at a time of, I think, renewed public embrace of certain aspects of biological determinism of identity. And the reason this was important and especially interesting for me is this is a time in the aftermath of when the Cohen modal haplotype studies on Jewish populations not only had these already been produced and published several years earlier. At this point, by the time I was a college student, these were actually appearing in my genetics textbooks already. I myself come from an Ashkenazi Jewish background. So within my own community, I was witnessing what seemed to be a high level of excitement around the idea of Jewish genes, which seemed on the one hand very interesting, but also increasingly disturbing to me as I continue to be a student of genetics. This is a phenomenon, of course, that was explored in detail by Nadia Abu-al-Hajj's very important book, The Genealogical Science. And then even beyond my own community, of course, at this time, by the mid to late 2000s, there was just increasing popularity of genetic ancestry testing, which has only increased, I think, in our present day. So as all of this is going on, sort of contextually as I'm undergoing my studies, I'm also experiencing very interesting attitudes by my professors, by fellow students at Berkeley, toward my specific combination of double majors. So for example, I was constantly getting this question: you're studying biology and Middle Eastern studies, what do those possibly have in common? What do they have to do with one another? And so for me, that was just this very clear signal that the contemporary region of the Middle East and North Africa is, it's just not considered a producer of scientific knowledge. And of course, we're talking about the wake of the post 9/11 context, where most people understood people's interest in Middle Eastern studies as being instrumental for careers in government, for example, or law enforcement, the perception of the Middle East as being a backward place. It might be a consumer of modern technologies and scientific discourses, but it was not involved in creating these technologies or sciences. And yet the very example of the Jewish genetic studies that were, they were, present in my textbooks, they were still being reported on heavily in the media, present in my community, as I said. Those studies relied very heavily on DNA comparisons with Middle Eastern peoples of all different kinds. And so those DNA samples had been collected by Middle Eastern scientists. And those samples were also taken to represent nationalist categories. For example, we saw ideas that, we have DNA similarities between different Jewish populations and Saudi Arabians and Lebanese and so on. These are obviously national categories representing countries that have existed for less than 100 years in most cases. And so observing these phenomena all together eventually coalesced into the initial research questions that would drive my PhD research, which was sort of, being a geneticist, I was working, evolutionary population genetics on animals. So looking over at the case of human genetics, I was sort of like, what's wrong here? What's going on that human geneticists can accept nationalities less than 100 years old as biological populations that are somehow valid for reconstructing human evolutionary history and really ancient human migrations? And what might be the role of Middle Eastern scientists in all this? And why is it that their contributions seem to be marginalized in the present and forgotten in the historical past? So from there, from this very sort of contemporary interest, I was trying to look for the roots of this story. And so when I began my PhD in Middle Eastern history, I jumped into the existing historiography. So I was moving from there to what had been done on the history of eugenics. So early 20th century race concepts, the embedding of these race concepts and eugenic ideas in Middle Eastern nationalist movements. So initially, a lot of these ideas about eugenics and the racialization of different groups had already been pretty well studied for the Zionist movement. And there was new work at the time I started my PhD that was accumulating on Iran and Turkey in particular. But all of these literatures, which were sort of oriented toward explaining specific nationalist movements, they weren't really in dialogue with each other. Instead of considering, kind of a regional history of how these ideas were spreading and how they were related to developments of scientific practice, a lot of the existing literature was referring back to individual intellectuals' educations in France or Switzerland or Germany, and pinpointing Europe really as the source of this racial thought. And when many of these authors encountered evidence of Middle Eastern participation in racial science, particularly physical anthropology or classification studies, this was sort of dismissed or written off as pseudoscience, just straight up nationally biased science, or the influence of Nazi propaganda. And they cited there the examples of German technicians and scientists who were present in Turkey and Iran in the interwar period and during the war. And so by the time I started doing field work for this dissertation, one of the first places I actually went was Germany. And I spent 2 months in German archive, looking at the Nazi archives. And this ended up feeling like a huge dead end. So I found out that what had been dismissed as influence of Nazi propaganda was seemingly really overstated. So the most influential Germans on the development of genetic science in the Middle East, as I found, were actually German Jewish refugees, so hardly representatives of Nazi ideology. So this idea that Nazi sympathies of certain Middle Eastern scientists, I found out, it really didn't explain the practices of racial research, the participation of a new class of professional scientists in the Middle East in racial classification studies. And so I start to realize that there's a big disconnect in what had been these earlier studies of Middle Eastern eugenics as a social and also a legal discourse, and the production of actual scientific knowledge through physical anthropology and also blood typing studies. So ultimately, I want to make clear for those who haven't yet read the book, this is not a history of eugenics. There's still ongoing excellent work, which I will encounter more in this workshop about the history of eugenics. But what my book does instead is it focuses on professional scientists who were actually engaged in trying to do empirical studies, trying to set on a scientific basis racial differences between Middle Eastern social groups, and to trace the origins of different Middle Eastern ethnic and religious groups. And so the methods that I ended up relying on to trace that heavily relied on looking through the history of scientific publications and then tracking down individual scientists and studying their practices of how they conceived their research, how they interacted with their research subjects, and how they interpreted the genetic data that they created. So a bit of a pet peeve of mine from this earlier literature that I was engaging with is that dismissal of Middle Eastern, racial ideas as just being an example of pseudoscience. And I understand very much our inclination that we're rightfully horrified often when we look back at these historical scientific studies, especially the nature and implications of how the research was done. But to use this term pseudoscience really obscures, I think, the participation of Middle Eastern people in what was in fact globally mainstream science. The other problem with the framing of Nazi pseudoscience for this early Middle Eastern racial research is the implication that by the 1950s, we suddenly have an allegedly more objective or accurate science of human population genetics that eschews racial categories and that can no longer be instrumentalized by nationalists. Now, this is in fact not true. And Dorothy Roberts, I would say her work has shown very, very clearly how this is not true and how, all kinds of resonances from these earlier nationally oriented, racially oriented sciences have persisted in different ways into the same human genetics and genomics that we practice today. So most of my book actually focuses on this period, this post-war period between the 1950s and the 1980s. And I really sort of obsessively traced what were these international networks and scientific collaborations, mostly between scientists in different parts of the Middle East and also between those scientists and their counterparts in Europe and North America. And yet, even though this was very much in internationally mainstream science, which involved the World Health Organization, UNESCO, all kinds of international organizations, I paradoxically found over and over that nationalism continued to be one of the most important analytics to understanding the methodologies of post-war human genetics and genomics today. And to briefly explain some of the examples, for example, scientists in certain countries like Turkey overwhelmingly tend to avoid collecting genetic data on specific ethnic or religious groups. Instead, there's a strong tendency to present data on a homogeneous national population category of Turks. And there's historical reasons why that emerged early in the 20th century and continues to be the main way that genetic data from Turkey is represented and interpreted today. On the other hand, scientists in different countries, especially, for example, Lebanon, Israel, and other parts of the Middle East, tended to hyper-focus on racializing specific religious groups. And this, of course, was often related to the importance of these specific groups to nationalist narratives of origins, as well as the use of nationalist historiographies to interpret the genetic data. So now to wrap up a little bit with some of the later realizations that I came to after I was more or less finished writing the dissertation and expanding my engagement with history of science as opposed to simply Middle Eastern history, as well as science and technology studies. By the time I was sort of done with the research process and I was reanalyzing the material from my dissertation, trying to come up with a narrative that would hold all of this material together for understanding this history of genetics and not just have a data dump, a representational study that yes, Middle Eastern scientists were important to this history. Instead, some of the narratives that for me held the story together, which were not comfortable narratives, I have to emphasize, is on the one hand, the really important role of the military in different countries, military violence, military occupation, in making it possible to do genetic research, to access certain populations, to collect their blood and use it for study. And then the second sort of major evolution was to realize that what I'm studying was not simply a specific sort of small field of anthropological genetics that we can bracket off and say this kind of genetics is problematic, but rather to realize how deeply this research was embedded in medical genetics and studies of diseases and embedded in the framework of international healthcare organizations. So these were things that I'd sort of overlooked due to a bias from my own specific scientific background. So the laboratories I was in, we were studying evolutionary genetics and sort of deep time. And personally, I was not working on humans, I was working on animals. So I neglected early on these connections to the medical profession and also the military, because these were not things that I experienced in my own laboratory career. But as I was excavating specifically this history of human genetics, I realized that these aspects are incredibly important parts of the story of race and genetics, not only in the Middle East, but the history of genetics more broadly around the world. So I think I just want to pause here. I'm so eager to hear what the discussants have to say and to hear more from the audience. And if I can just make one final comment. Firstly, this is, I recognize, quite a long book. And I think I see my editor from Stanford University Press here in the audience. And she worked very hard to convince me to trim parts out of the book to streamline the narrative. And yet, even so, I just want to emphasize that what I've done here is only scratching the surface. There's so much more to be done in histories of science and race in the Middle East and North Africa. And even if we're talking specifically about the history of human genetics, there is so much I had to leave out. I know that there's so many more sources out there. And so I'm really hoping that this book is not actually the definitive account of this history, but this is going to be a launch pad and hopefully generate a lot of new research. So with that, I'll stop here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And thanks again, everyone, for being here.
Thank you so much for giving us an overview and a history of your way into the topic. Dorothy Roberts, please.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Elise, for that interesting backdrop to your work on the book and for the book, Genetic Crossroads. I think it makes such an important contribution to our understanding of how genetics and social knowledge are, in your terms, co-constituted. And as you know, you kind of referred to it, my work has focused on genetic concepts of race in the United States, the history of it, and the way in which some of the very same ideas about inheritance and racial difference are reemerging, even being accentuated in genetic science today and biomedical research and medical practice. So many of my comments relate to how your book contributes to that scholarship. I'm not a Middle Eastern scholar at all, although I did live in Egypt for a couple of years, so I have a warm heart toward the Middle East. But really, it brought up so many resonances with the ideas I've been working on related to racial science in the United States. So hopefully it'll be helpful to talk about ways in which your work engages with that work and complicates it. That's what I found so fascinating about your book, is that it really complicates ways in which many of the scholars of race and genetics have been writing about it. And I think it complicates it in three ways. And then I want to point out three areas that I'd like you to talk about some more, maybe in our discussion, and explore some more. So the three main ways I thought your book advances ideas about genetic research, and especially the critique of the idea that genetic research is objective and unencumbered by politics. So, and those are the way you complicate the Black-white paradigm and the view of race in the United States, the way you have a global perspective on how racial ideas are transported around the world, which often gets left out. And then your focus on professionals. And that's really what I want to home in on later in my brief comments. So let me just highlight some of the ways in which I thought your book complicated the typical way that US, and maybe I'm thinking of sociologists mostly, and legal scholars, those are the fields I work in the United States, which tend to look at how ideas about racial difference distinguish between Black people and white people. And so you added this focus on Middle Eastern science and genetics, which doesn't fit into that paradigm. Although you do talk about how it relates to that paradigm, but it certainly doesn't fit in the paradigm. And a lot of times the Middle East is, as well as the subcontinent of India, are seen as classifications that don't fit. Geneticists, US geneticists sometimes have left them out because they don't quite fit in the main paradigm. And then your focus on nationality also complicates the main category of race. And so I found it really interesting how you show the ways in which Middle Eastern scientists slip between race, ethnic differences, and national identity. And that, I think, gives us some insight and helps us to question the way in which US geneticists have started substituting ethnicity for race. So it really questions this idea that ethnicity is somehow less problematic than race. In fact, I thought it was interesting that you call all of this racial research and that's something we might want to talk about in the discussion, whether we can, or whether you can distinguish research on ethnic genetic diversity from racial research. So when I was working on my book, Fatal Invention, I interviewed Rick Kittles, who was a US geneticist and the founder of the first genetic ancestry testing company that focuses on African Americans and claims to be able to trace their ancestry to tribes in Africa. And he made the point that his research dispels the idea of genetic race because he shows that Black people are actually made up of diverse tribal groups. And so it raises this question of whether studying the genetic origins and commonalities and differences among ethnic groups disrupts the idea of race, or does it reinforce it? And then your exploration of the possibility of promoting a unitary national identity at the same time as you're promoting the idea, genetic scientists in the Middle East are promoting the idea of diverse ethnic traits. Is that possible? Is that what can we learn from that tension between ideas of unity produced by genetic knowledge at the same time as the same research or researchers are producing ideas of diverse ethnic traits within that unitary national identity. And that, I think, speaks to bigger questions about ideas of human genetic unity and diversity, and the way in which some US genetic scientists acknowledge a single human species, and that our human species is very genetically diverse, but at the same time confined within that genetic diversity racial categories, or they claim to be able to find them. And then the other theme that I thought you complicated was the idea of historical isolation and the importance to these geneticists of finding at some point in human history original ethnic group that was isolated enough to be distinguished from other ethnic groups. And that parallels the assumption by US other geneticists who claim that races are genetically distinct, that at some point in human history, there was this formation of races somewhere in between the evolution of the human species in Africa and the point at which the races formed, and then a subsequent point when they admixed. And so this is a big question in the study of the genetics of race that parallels your research on how Middle Eastern scientists are studying historical origins of ethnic groups. Again, this really, I think, presses us to think about whether there's a difference between studying ethnic genetic diversity and racial genetic diversity, and these bigger themes that tie together both of them, like this question of history, in this mythical point in human history, human evolutionary history, that as far as I can tell, no one has figured out when it was, but it's so important to assume that this historical point existed, whether we're talking about the point when the races emerged or the point where various ethnic groups emerged. And then your book challenges, or well, exposes this acceptance of the nation state as a natural formation, but also all populations as natural formations. So you point out that figuring out population boundaries is important to genetic research generally, but you're focusing on the research of Middle Eastern geneticists. And it really raises this question of, if all population boundaries are made up, which I think your book shows, how do we do genetic research without reinforcing the racial foundations of the way in which scientists think about populations? So that's one major contribution. This complicating the idea of race, but then at the same time questioning, I think your work raises the question of whether this research on ethnic groups can be distinguished from racial research. And I would really love for you to talk about in our discussion why you call all of it racial research. I think you're right, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. And then, of course, a major contribution is your focus on the global circulation of ideas about race and genetics. Just your contribution, which you said you didn't just want your book to be this, and it isn't just this, but your contribution of carefully looking at the history, uncovering the history of genetic research in the Middle East is, I think that's very significant. But you don't just do that. I think what I found really important was the way in which Middle Eastern geneticists are engaging, negotiating with these global meanings of race and ethnicity, global ways of doing genetic and biomedical research, and applying it to the specific interests and geopolitics of the Middle East. And speaking of geopolitics, another contribution is so much of the research, including my own in the United States, with respect to race and genetics, focuses on its origins in slavery. And your books focus on colonialism, or at least the legacies of colonialism is an important addition to that, including your theme of war and the way in which war literally supplied the research material and human subjects for this research in the Middle East. Okay, and then the third big contribution I thought was your focus on the professionals who are doing this research. And I think we don't pay enough attention. There are some sociologists who have looked at anthropologists, Dwayne Fulwiley, for example, Catherine Bliss, who really do focus on the professionals themselves. But much of the research looks at the outcomes, the findings, without questioning how the profession of genetic researcher gets shaped and constituted, before they constitute, or well, it's again co-constituted with the way that they do the research. And I thought it was really fascinating how you look at the professional life of genetic researchers in the Middle East as related both to their national and their transnational contexts. This is, I think, an important contribution to an important contribution to contesting the idea that they're doing neutral research, which may seem so obvious, especially to STS scholars, but there are still, as you probably know, many, many people in the United States, at least, who believe that this research is neutral, and many genetic scientists who claim that it is. And by focusing on them as professionals, I think that helps to dispel that idea and helps us to think about new ways of exposing how their research isn't neutral. Also, you're bringing in the medical profession. What is really important, I think, in the US, physicians, biomedical researchers have been absolutely essential to promoting ideas of inherited racial difference. So, historically, people like Samuel Cartwright, who trained at University of Pennsylvania Medical School and promoted the idea that Black people's lungs lacked the capacity for them to be healthy, so they had to be forced to work by white people, and lots of examples of how medical professionals historically were essential to promoting the racial concept of disease, which was essential to promoting the biological concept of race. But today, it's so common for research being done on the genetics of race in the studies for the justification for continuing it to be, well, it's going to be useful to ending health inequities. And it's also one of the main ways that current day genetic researchers and biomedical researchers who are studying racial differences in genes, the way that they distinguish themselves from eugenicists, the idea that they're doing it for anti-racist reasons in order to benefit especially non-white people's health has just been, I think, critical to continuing these ideas that we can trace, back many centuries. So what I would love to talk about more that I thought was very provocative in your work was the different levels of asymmetrical power in which these scientific collaborations are taking place. And I'm really interested in the way power dynamics affect scientific collaborations across nations and across disciplines. So if I could just say a little bit about that, maybe to generate some discussion about it. You look at 3 different power structures, I think, in which genetic scientists in the Middle East are collaborating with others. One is the local national level, then there's the global level, and there's the disciplinary level. So at the local level, we have these technocratic elites who are investigating marginalized ethnic populations in the service of other people's agendas, both national agendas and international agendas. And I wondered whether there was any resistance by these groups to being, I don't know if I want to say used, but being studied in this way, and whether there was, I guess, a local politics around seeing ethnic and national identities as genetic, sort of again, a resistance to that. I also wondered more about your own views of whether these genetic definitions of nation and ethnic group are inherently racist, or at least supporting of racial science and racial ideas of human unity and difference, or whether there could be something empowering about it. And again, I may be speaking from a legal scholar and sociologist perspective rather than a historian's perspective, but I'm really interested in that. And then the way in which Middle Eastern genetic scientists are caught in this tension, you call it a contradiction, of contesting European approaches to genetics, but at the same time, really adopting many of the Western, European perspectives on race and biodeterminism. And one example is the question of whether people in the Middle East are white and how white they are. Are they part of the white race? Of course, that's a question in the US now, as you probably know. The people from the Middle East have been categorized as white for purposes of the US Census. And there was a big debate about adding a new category of Middle Eastern, North African. And so I wonder whether the work of Middle Eastern geneticists looking at both national identities and also diverse ethnic identities, perhaps the idea that they're an admixture of European, African, and Asian, whether that contests the categorization of Middle Eastern people as white, or whether there is a way in which white race is essential in the end to all of this genetic research. And then I have this is a big question, a question about why is it that these ideas of race are so resilient? So you point out in your book how Middle Eastern scientists are taking, applying scientific knowledge to the particular politics and interests and even, medical needs of people in the Middle East. And yet there's a way in which these concepts of race continue, over the history across geographic boundaries. What is it that makes these ideas so resilient? And then finally, there's the disciplinary power structure that these scientists are working in. I thought it was so interesting that you mentioned I think it's in your acknowledgements, but you also mentioned it in your introduction today, that your book comes out of your interest in biology and Middle Eastern studies, and how you were advised to study history. And today there is a real turn of biological scientists to want to speak on social policy. I think biological scientists have always tried to influence social policy and have done a terrible job of it by and large, but especially when it comes to race. So it's not really new, but there is this current trend, as you probably know, toward neuroscientists and geneticists making really concrete proposals about how their science can shape social policy for the good. And that has led to more and more collaborations between social scientists and biologists. Lots of sociological research, some would argue, has to include genetics to get funded, some would say. But and that alludes to what I want to say about the power dynamics there, where within these interdisciplinary collaborations, there tends to be priority given, a prestige given to the biological scientists. And often the humanities are left out altogether. So much so that some geneticists have said, we don't need historians anymore. We can figure it out using the DNA. And I have always advocated for the need to include the humanities, philosophy and history in particular, and critical studies in these collaborations. And it's just something I think that's so important. I mean, your book really highlights how biodeterminism predates modern science, well, predates genetics. I think it predates modern science. The historians have pointed out, it's a theological concept. The race is a theological concept that predates the Enlightenment. Historians have been the ones to show that, and it's so important to understand that in order to understand contemporary genetics. And so I thought maybe that might be something we want to talk about, how to get the humanities more front and center in these collaborations that are having an impact on social policy. And again, I think often a dangerous impact on social policy because they tend to highlight a kind of biological determinism. And finally, I wondered if, I wondered what the role of the humanities is in terms of helping to shape the future of biosocial collaborations. I wondered if historians, if they're part of their role is to challenge the way in which these collaborations continue to promote dangerous, we know harmful ideas about the biological origins of race. And just one last point, there were aspects of your work that really reminded me of the work of sociologists and now Biden, one of the deputy in charge of science of the United States, Alondra Nelson, her book, The Social Life of DNA, which is about the African Americans' use of genetic genealogy. And it parallels your work in the sense that she also focuses on how African American geneticists like Rick Kittles have been so essential to getting Black Americans interested and comfortable with genetic genealogy. There's so much for the idea that Black people don't appreciate science. Black people have embraced these genetic testing as much as anybody else, but largely because of the professionals, the Black professionals. And Nelson points out that they use genetic genealogy not in a categorical way where they just accept it as telling them something about their identities, but they merge it with other cultural and social ideas about their identities to form a new identity that includes genetic information but doesn't entirely rely on it. And I wondered if there was something like that. This may be another project, but something like that going on related to my question about any resistance at the the grassroots level to these ideas, or some kind of refashioning of the results that come from these genetic scientists about ethnic diversity and identity to use it, but also resist it as an essential singular way of thinking about identity in the Middle East. So I'll end there, and thanks again. I hope my comments weren't too off base because they came from a different discipline, but I really appreciated your book, and it got me thinking about all these questions I've had about the study of race and genetics in the United States in a much more complex and provocative way. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dorothy Roberts. We really appreciated your comments, and we're excited to see that our fields can produce knowledge that doesn't just move in one direction from the West to us, but it's moving back. So that's really one of the goals of the Sawyer seminar and what we're doing. So thank you very much and I'm sure that Elise is waiting to come in and weigh in some of the things. Eve, do you want to go ahead?
It's up to you, Elise. What would you prefer?
I'd like to hear from you, Eve. So why don't you go ahead, and then I'll try to respond to both of you after that, I think.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, all right. Okay, that sounds great. So first of all, let me also say, well, Elise, you know this since I first heard you present on this project at Mesa a couple of years ago. I publicly had to pick up my jaw and put it back in because I was just so amazed, not only by your scholarship and the grace of your writing, but also how many languages you cover. And the depth of the language communities that you look at here has been very helpful to me as I sort through with others, particularly at Mesa, about the different vocabularies in which race is involved and how important it is. Well, I think one of the things that your book does is through biology, through the study of genetics, we have that language of race, but it's also a language in which in Persian, in Arabic, in Turkish, in Hebrew, you know, we have a different vocabulary that ends up being mixed with the scientific language. That's really, I mean, in addition to what Dorothy is saying about how important this book is in dialogue with discussions of these same subjects in the United States, it also shows how important these discussions have been in the Middle East for a very long time, with English and without it. So that's one of the first things I want to say. You know, why I love this project so much and why I can understand. I mean, I didn't feel like this was a long book at all, Elise. I could have read another book of this, to be honest with you. And it's very interesting to hear you say, you know, that so much was left out. I know how good Kate Wall is at helping us get to the narrative. And so that is very much appreciated. Anyway, so let me start with, I just have some questions really. And then I have some questions and maybe one last comment. So first of all, I love the way you tell this narrative, and I love the fact that you go through the chronology that you go through, and I really appreciate that. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but I did want to say that within this narrative is a very interesting history of Israel and of Palestine. And the next time I teach my course, which I teach every other year on Israel and Palestine and Palestinians and Israelis, I'm going to be using a lot of this book for that, because it is a very interesting construction and exploration, and if you will permit me to use this word, exposure, of how the deep racialization of Zionism in a way that I think you call out. I just haven't seen anyone call it out as directly as you do. And it's a very, very important part of this book. You know, and while there is an increasing amount of study right now on perhaps the Ashkenazim versus the Mizrahim, and sort of, and how, where Arab blood lies in between these, you know, I think what you have done here is also very importantly set up the racial spectrum that is so important to Israel right now, and so important, I mean, especially given what we just saw, you know, last week. you know, where Palestinians themselves fit on this, and you don't leave them out, as so many do. They stop, and that's it. You know, we stop at Gaza, we stop at the West Bank, and you don't. So bravo to you for that. And it's really fascinating how you go through that. So I just wanted to, you know, when you were talking about Judaism as a race, you know, which I think is an issue that all of us, you know, teaching anything about the Middle East have to confront when we are constantly, you know, seeing the debate between, you know, calling out Israel or BDS being called anti-Semitism. I think your work goes really, really far in complicating, you know, and exposing and highlighting that discussion. I also want to say that in another kind of history that is now starting to be told more and more within the Middle East, within Middle East studies, whether that be history or other fields within Middle Eastern studies, is there is a deep history of slavery discussed here that, and here's what's so interesting about it, that is so difficult to discuss within the Middle East itself. And yet here in this book, you show that when communities, either the professionals within those communities or members of the communities who have given their blood, you know, when these communities are confronted with a disease like sickle cell anemia, okay, and they're like, how can we have that? We're not Black, you know, how can must be slavery. I was so struck by this in Iran, in the Iranian context, where, you know, we know now from Bita Baghoudizade's work and from other people's work that, you know, everything about race in Iran was sort of muted. Because of nationalism, because of Reza Pahlavi, and then here it is, and there it is. There is the discussion of slavery right there. You know, it happens in Egypt, and it's very, very interesting. You talk about it in reference to Turkey, and of course, my question, and I know there are people in this Zoom room who can ask this question better than I can, is of course you're talking about the moment under Ataturk when you have the monochromatism project, you know, and Afro-Turks are completely left out, although they continue to live there and are continue to be there. So I thought that was just fascinating. I love that chapter, by the way, on sickle cell. And I think that's the chapter or part of that I heard at Mesa. I did want to say that it did feel like, especially with the conversation about sickle cell and the scientific, it was almost a scientific escape from Blackness that went on. And as somebody who comes from a family deeply, deeply affected by sickle cell anemia, you know, I was really struck by that. And it seemed to be, and here's where I think what Dorothy has to say is so important. It seemed to be, and I'm going to use an old-fashioned word, miscegenation with anybody African, you know, was just as frightening within many parts of the Middle East as it was to the point of becoming illegal in the United States. And of course, not just the United States, you know. So I was really, you know, this, you know, in Yemen, in Arabia, and all these places where this fear of miscegenation and how that works with these whispers towards the history of slavery, you know, like, well, it's not really our fault. We didn't really mix, you know, but there were these slaves. And you know, the slaves don't seem to have been brought, they were just there, you know, so okay. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more. There is a moment in your book where you have, his name is Dr. Bowman, I believe, and he's an African-American geneticist, very interesting. And there's this moment where he's sitting, I think he's in Tel Aviv, and he's done all this work in Iran, and then someone starts sort of mansplaining to him all about, Iranian populations. And then he says, and I can only imagine his affect and his attitude, please get your history correct. Iran is not an Arab country, and which is such an interesting moment. And, but there are many Arabic speaking, even his certitude is incorrect. And he's such an interesting figure in this book. And I was going to just ask you just to tell a little bit more to the audience in your response about him and about the Ashkenazi Israeli woman, Bonet, her last name Bonet, and just how interesting their roles are here. And finally, I did want to ask you, and this is actually not so much to you, Elise, but to the shared intellectual pool that all of us represent at this moment, about African geneticists and about how these ideas have been received, rejected, and what ideas come from scientists in other places, scientists in Nigeria, for instance, geneticists in places like Cote d'Ivoire, where the whole concept of what is being Cote d'Ivoirian, what that means, and so there's a whole nother layer, here of professionals, that just further complicate the whole construct of Blackness, in addition to your beautifully complicating, the whole construct of whiteness. And let me just end by saying I'm very, very grateful to you for this book. And I'm really looking forward to what you think of next.
Thank you, Eve, for your very insightful comments. Elise, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much to both of you. It's really humbling, to be honest, to hear that you think so highly of the contributions of this book. So I really, really appreciate that. As far as some of the questions that you highlighted, and I'm sure that you are aware of this, several of them are very complicated to answer, and I won't be able to necessarily cover them. And as you rightly pointed out, some of them will actually require an entire other project to sort of really address these complications. So if we're starting backward, for example, Eve's final question about what is the role of geneticists from different parts of Africa in participating in what are really these international scientific debates about Blackness, whether it's about sickle cell disease or other attempts to sort of trace racial ancestry. That is a question that I can't yet answer. I wasn't even able to include North African geneticists in this book, which is a whole other interesting story. It really would have been fascinating, especially the case of Algeria, for example, where this research is taking place. The century I cover, we're talking about the violent decolonization of Algeria at the same time as research is being actively undertaken on the one hand by Pied Noir geneticists, so people of French origin who consider Algeria their home, and yet they are working directly with Arab Algerians at different levels, to working together to study intensively Berber populations. So there's all kinds of other complications, which I would expect to also be replicated in different parts of Africa, where you have these, what are essentially scientific teams working together of what we would call, native geneticists or technicians alongside colonial scientists, or so-called independent Western or global North scientists who sometimes come, to study these populations. And the role of those African, or in the same way, the Middle Eastern scientists I talk about, who come largely from these elite social groups, in then studying what are the primary interests of these geneticists, especially in the post-war period, which are specifically socially marginalized groups. So there's all these power asymmetries involved, and I would expect to see that also happening in different parts of Africa as well. But I can't wait to see, somebody needs to do a similar project, right, for Africa. I know that I just read a book manuscript recently, which will come out soon, of a similar project in South Asia, and there you see similar dynamics again. So that's why I am very hopeful that my book is the first of what will be larger, a whole literature on global histories of genetics, which will explore these dynamics and their complications in real detail. And I think actually my comments just now trace back a little bit to some of the things that Dorothy was raising, and the question of, I don't think I do this very forcefully within my book, but in my opening comments just now, I did use the term racial research as kind of an umbrella term to talk about what was going on, even across time. So the geneticists themselves might not always have identified their research as being racial research, but you can see in the way that they did their studies, the way that they interpreted the data, that there's a family resemblance in the way that the research was done, the methodology, the implications of it. So why is it even possible to call all of this racial research? I'm thinking mostly, the way that I approach this is, of course, as someone who is not sympathetic at all to the idea of biological race. Instead, what I'm working with is the idea of processes of racialization. So in that sense, I do think the term racial research is powerful because we see that these same genetic methods are being used to racialize very different kinds of social categories. So on the one hand, the geneticists are studying what they would call tribal groups or clans. They're studying religious sects and communities. They're studying groups that they define by linguistic differences, and usually what we call ethnic groups tend to be derived from the linguistic groups, although not always, right? And along the same lines, when we're talking about the kind of shift in scientific discourse that is at least superficially taking place after World War II, the sort of what's sometimes perceived as the triumph of the idea that races are socially constructed, right? Around the same time that this discourse is becoming more and more prominent, not only within the scientific community, but also in the public consciousness, around the same time that this is happening, this is when population geneticists then turn to studying what they call socially isolated groups. So it's all sort of a piece with each other. So in that sense, even though the scientists are using different terminology and to a certain extent, different kinds of statistical methodologies and so on to understand what they're doing, they are just in a way following along the same kind of social public discourse rationales for identifying these categories. So in that sense, I think it still makes a lot of sense to emphasize that continuity. And to call it racial research, let's face it, it makes us uncomfortable, and I think that it should make us uncomfortable. And that helps us to keep a critical sort of focus on the methodologies that are being used, and especially with the present day methodologies of genomic science, which, to be honest, is a step beyond what even I studied as an undergraduate geneticist. Like, now the expectation of how much data you generate from samples is just exponentially so much greater. So that where I was sequencing single genes in the lab, painstakingly one at a time, now it's expected that every sample, you can get a whole genome out of it, and then you have to process that data. So there's now this attitude that because we have so much data and it's being processed and analyzed through what are supposed to be more and more sophisticated statistical methods, there's now this perception, okay, now it's all numbers. it's more objective, it's more reliable. But as I think Dorothy highlighted very much in her comments, that's, in a way, it's window dressing, which is actually concealing the fact that who gets studied and then how the numbers end up getting analyzed and translated, whether it's into policy or medicine or narratives of human origins and diversity. These things still have really important continuities. So I think maybe by centering this idea that it is still part of a genealogy of racial research, it still relies on the same kind of socially constructed categories, even if we call those categories by different terms. I think that this is what we have to force ourselves to sort of reckon with this idea. It's still part of a process of racialization. I think to move from there.
By the way,
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that's one of the important contributions of your book. That's why I say that it helps us to understand why you can't just say, take race out, which many of these scientists are doing in the US. They know that it's problematic to use the word race, so they just substitute ethnicity. Some of them will say, I'm just, and I think your book points out why that doesn't solve the fundamental problem of racializing populations. But so thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think from there, I want to, because I talked about discomfort and how we should have a critical eye. And in that sense, I am sort of emphasizing the aspect of the history in which the power symmetry between research subject and the professional scientists. And I did record, in this book, many stories in which research subjects are in very exploitative relationships. In many cases, they are sort of tricked or coerced into giving blood. I mean, and this is, of course, I talk about a period that is mostly before the era of informed consent, but even after, informed consent hasn't really solved the problem, is something that I argue toward the end. But I do emphasize that sometimes you have situations where the researchers are essentially sort of bribing certain research subjects to give blood in exchange for medical care or cash, all kinds of things. But to follow along with Dorothy's question of, was this ever empowering? Were there examples of resistance? Yeah, I actually found many different kinds of sort of complicating relationships. So it's not like a uniform story of exploitation and scientists are all evil. That is not the story that I'm trying to tell. In fact, there are many cases where we also saw, for example, that tribal leaders sometimes played an important sort of mediating role in sort of getting their members to cooperate with the scientists. You had certain communities that in fact were very enthusiastic about what kinds of claims genetics could make available to them. I think I highlight this the most in the case of the Samaritans in Palestine. And also, I don't talk about this as much, but also Zoroastrian communities in Iran were in general welcoming of this research and the ways that it could entitle them to certain kinds of Iranian nationalist claims about being the original Iranians and so on. So we see a lot of different and very interesting interactions between research subjects and the scientists. So we do have some research subjects who are actually very involved in the process of their own genetic racialization. And they generally have sort of political motivations for doing that. And then we also have cases where we see active refusal of communities to take part in the research. And some of the clearest examples of that I saw were hospital patients who were attending hospitals to to get treatment. Sometimes they wouldn't be allowed to be seen by a doctor until they had given a drop of blood to like a waiting scientist who was visiting. And these people would resist as much as possible. Some of them would leave the hospital and not get treatment in an effort to avoid participating. So that particular example was in the Baghdad Jewish Hospital in the 1930s. Second example, which I think won't be surprising, is the variable participation of Palestinians in the Israeli genetic research, and also Bedouin groups in the occupied Sinai Peninsula. So I record examples there of how the fact that the geneticists, were often accompanied by military officials or other representatives of the Israeli government, tended to affect whether they participated in donating their blood, whether they refused, or whether they, sort of grudgingly participated with the sense that this was, these are people, who are trying to survive. So you can't necessarily assume that their participation is willing, again. So even if we have characters like Batsheva Bonet, who Eve also asked me to talk about a little more. So this is a very interesting woman who perceived herself to be much more anthropologically informed than many of her colleagues. She regarded herself as being something of an ethnographer in addition to a geneticist. And so she believes, when she's interacting with the Bedouin, with the Samaritans, with other groups in Palestine or other Israeli occupied territories, that she is not necessarily in an exploitative relationship with these groups. Like this is really important actually to her own identity that she tries to build for herself as a certain kind of geneticist. But when you sort of, and this was actually very important to my methodology of sort of reading against the grain of some of the scientific publications, as well as some of her archived letters, that she did, in fact, so even though there was a tendency to represent in her work, her autobiography, for example, that, she always managed to establish a rapport with her research subjects, and they were always very willing. The evidence actually shows that this was not uniformly true. And she tended to gloss over instances where there was reluctance to participate. Or sort of uneven, the inability to get a good sample is something that the geneticists talk about a lot. So you have variable participation and resistance from members of the community. So actually we see that they can't be treated as a block the way that geneticists want to treat them biologically as a block. There were just so many rich questions. I'm trying to see if I can link a couple of them together. So I think this also speaks a little bit to Dorothy's question about examples in which genetic identities don't always replace existing identity formations, but can be added on. I think, in fact, I see this extremely commonly. In fact, I think it's very rare that I found examples where it seemed to me that genetic identities were supposed to be totally sweeping away what came before. And in this way, I can also link it to the question of collaborations between biologists and social scientists and historians, which are increasingly popular today. And it's seen as a way that humanists and social scientists can get money from our sort of cash-starved departments. And on the other hand, you have a certain hubris from some biologists that believe we don't actually need historians. All we need is the sequences, and we can reconstruct the history all by ourselves. And there is, like I saw historically, like in the chapter on the initial history of blood typing, there was at first an initial perception, even back in the 1920s and 30s, that yes, medical professionals could do the same thing. They could, reconstruct the whole history through, this allegedly scientific method. But actually what we see by the end of the 1930s and up till today is that it's impossible to reconstruct history through DNA sequences without the addition of other kinds of historical, linguistic, archaeological information. In fact, and I believe I can say this as someone who sort of understands the underlying genetic methodology, but also my mother is actually an archaeologist, and she increasingly sees a lot of studies on ancient DNA, in which, of course, in that case, they're taking the DNA samples from, archaeological human remains. And she always complains they publish all these aDNA studies as though they're so new and exciting, they're getting tons of money. In the end, the conclusions of the studies often tend to be, oh, what archaeologists have been saying all along, we can't disprove or deny it. So, so actually they're not necessarily adding to our historical knowledge. And what I would say as someone who knows both methods of trying to do the history, both the scientific aspect of it, but also someone who's dedicated to more traditional historical methods, is that what genetics does, it doesn't add an independent source of historical data. It's not independent, because the sequences themselves, when I saw them on the screen, when I saw them interpreted by my statistical software, it's meaningless without the addition of other kinds of information, even when that's non-biological information. So when biologists claim that they don't need historians on their team, what that usually means is that they're reading outdated history books, which will explain to them what the numerical data can mean. And it means that they're not participating with the most up-to-date or complicated historical research. So I don't think, so I hope we see the end of that idea of biologists that they can do it all on their own. And if historians can and are willing to participate, if they can make their voices heard, as Dorothy said, these will always be prestige asymmetrical collaborations, but I do hope that historians can play important roles there. And I see some potential in the kind of histories that Nuket Varlik in our field does, so attempts to rewrite Ottoman histories of the plague alongside geneticists who are sequencing the plague microbe, as opposed to attempting to do this kind of reconstruction using only human sequences. All right, so I feel like I've talked for a long time, even though I've not answered all the great questions, but I would like to hear some more questions from the audience and hopefully bring this into a wider discussion. So thank you so much again to Eve and Dorothy.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you, Eve and Dorothy for providing such great questions and comments. So if people could write their questions in the chat if they have questions. Tamara is going to be reading the questions, but I think we'll start with Mandana asking a question. And Mandana, who I apologize, I introduced her at the outset, but just to sort of stress that Mandana is a co-PI on the grant, and I'm really grateful to her for all of the intellectual input in putting the seminar together and for bringing Elise's work to us today.
Oh, you're so kind, Beth, and everybody. I really appreciate it. This was just so amazing. I just would love for Eve and Elise and Dorothy just to keep on talking and having us watch you, listen to you, go back and forth. But I know you're a little tired, but sort of in that spirit, Elise, I actually wanted to go back to a question that was raised a little bit. Dorothy raised it earlier, which was so, and I think it goes to some of what Eve was asking you too, which is what's one of the things that's so fascinating in this book is that these scientists are clearly recognizing, or it seems to me, this is a question, recognizing in part the fallacy of their own constructions, right? And I think this is what Dorothy was getting at in terms of the tension between the diversity of the traits and the claims of national unity. So I was kind of curious if you could say a little bit more about, maybe ideology is the wrong term, it's a little too forceful, but something about the power of that narrative and where you saw, I mean, I don't want to say belief or intent, but there's something so fascinating by the fact that clearly what they're proving is not what the material necessarily is showing all the time. So what do you, just can you say a little bit more about that tension or contradiction? Dorothy said tension, you said contradiction. Where do you sit, and can you say a little bit more?
Thank you. This is a good question. And I think it's a really important one, because I think there's a tendency of geneticists and other scientists that when these, tensions and contradictions get pointed out to them, there's a tendency to sort of claim that, oh, we don't understand how complicated the science is, or there's an attempt to sort of claim that if it appears to be contradictory, that's only because, somehow we're not schooled enough to really understand the underlying things. But I actually think this is sort of a roundabout way of scientists making a claim to innocence. In terms of they're trying to distance themselves from the potential implications of the work that they do, or that, that they're somehow ignorant and therefore can't be blamed for ways in which their work might be misinterpreted, so on and so forth. However, as social scientists, as historians, when we go back and see these tensions, we can actually recognize that this is evidence that the scientists do, in fact, know very much what the implications of their work can be and what they can be used for. I don't see any other way to interpret cases like, for example, the case I make out of Muzaffer Aksoy, the Turkish scientist who is researching sickle cell disease in a specific marginalized group, Arabic-speaking Alawites in southern Turkey. This is a case where, interestingly, Aksoy is incredibly ambivalent about why these Alawites might have such high rates of sickle cell disease. Will say things like, oh, it could be because of legacies of slavery. So even though he very clearly considers them to be white, he refers to them several times as, examples of members of the so-called white race who have sickle cell disease. And this is such a curiosity, and he says, maybe this is because of Black admixture as a result of slavery. Maybe it's a result of this new theory, which has just been advanced at the time, that malaria has a natural selection role, which would have been affecting this particular group in southern Turkey. But even though he doesn't care, or he's content to be ambivalent about specifically why they have the disease, he says over and over, quite explicitly at international medical conferences, whatever else you may think of this group, they are not Arab. So, the one thing that he's very sure that he wants everyone to know, it's not because they have Arab ancestry. Why would he bother, constantly making this claim unless he thought it was somehow related to these lingering, problems from the early phase of Turkish nationalism, their concerns about potential ethnic separatism or solidarity between Arabs along Turkey's borders and the new Arab states. He's very aware. And as I tried to make clear in this case, he's making that argument at a medical conference sponsored by the WHO and UNESCO in 1957, when there is an active military conflict between Turkey and Syria. They know, okay, the scientists are not, cloistered in their laboratories, totally ignorant of the historical implications or the present day sort of territorial implications. So I think to try to understand what's going on, so to answer this, the scientists, they do, I think, recognize, just as you said, the problematic of their own narratives. But there's always some sort of wiggle room within the scientific data that allows them to reconcile sort of what they want to see versus what could be considered sort of a new discovery generated solely from the data. And so, so that's sort of my way of addressing this, that the scientists, they're not naive. They're not stupid. They know, and when they claim otherwise, that is always also sort of an instrumental claim that they're making.
Okay, so I think we'll turn to the chat, and Tamara, can you read out the question from Marie?
Of course. So the question goes as such. You have a wonderful phrase in your chapter on traffic in the blood about how local actors were responsible for transforming, placing, containing communities into vials of blood. Could you speak more about this moment of disruption?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite make out the last bit. What can I say more about?
This moment of disruption.
The moment of destruction.
Disruption.
Of disruption. Sorry. Yeah, so what I was trying to get at in that particular chapter was, how is it possible, kind of alluding back to the question that I was just addressing, that we have this distance sort of created from scientists within the laboratory who believe that who believe that they're distanced, I guess, from what the research subjects are experiencing in their real life, out in the field. So the sort of distance that we talk about in history of science between the laboratory and the field, in terms of going out and doing field work, collecting the blood samples. And so what I'm trying to bring together in this chapter is that you have this whole network of people necessary to make the science work, where on the one end you have groups of people who are getting the samples from specific communities, who in many cases might know the members of the communities. They have pedigrees drawn out. They know how the people are related to each other. And then of course they, if they're local workers, then they have a deep understanding of how this community fits into the broader social context of this particular place. And then the disruption that's going on is that when the blood samples are put in the vials, all this information then gets divorced, right? And the information doesn't always travel to the laboratories, to the workers who are then trying to do the kind of lab-based analyses, the statistics that are being derived. The information that's put on the vial is often just sort of a disembodied sample number. The laboratory worker is totally dependent on the people who did the blood collection work in the field to explain or create the narrative about who these people are. So where did the sample come from? What kinds of identities does it correspond to? So that was sort of the goal of that particular chapter. So did that address the question?
It's Marie's question. So I don't know if Marie is on, can wait.
Can I say something?
Yeah. Go ahead, Marie.
Oh, yeah, I think it gets to it. I guess I love this moment of the local actors with that local knowledge, and then the loss of that context, right? Once the blood comes into the vial, right? And it just, we sort of move from like the human to a numbered label. And so I was just thinking that might be a place that I wanted to know more about, that moment of the movement from human to scientific subject, maybe.
Right, no, it's fascinating process, and it does happen a little bit differently in different places. So like from that chapter, you saw that the kind of people who are doing the actual blood sampling can sometimes be very different. So sometimes, for example, when I was talking the case about the Egyptian hospital doctor, military doctors mostly, who are then actually doing their own lab work. So for them, there's not actually this really dramatic process of distancing, although they are treating who they're studying sort of as their military soldiers, right? So there's already this a certain kind of nationalist sort of military context. And yet when they're trying to address the question of whether there's a genetic difference, right, between Copts and Muslims, for them, you know, they live in Egypt. For them, this is a living social structure that they are a part of. In contrast, when you had the sort of competing researcher, the British guy who is receiving samples, you know, much smaller samples of blood, which are collected by a British military officer and then shipped, you know, over to England, then there's a much more dramatic distancing, right, between the person who's collecting the blood, the research subject, and then what's going abroad to this British scientist and his perception and his, in a way, kind of obsession with finding that there should in fact be a difference. And, you know, why is he invested in detecting this difference in a way that the Egyptian doctors are invested? The Egyptian doctors are curious, but they're much more skeptical. And I don't think we should be surprised about that, given sort of the colonial investment of the British, the Europeans, right, in sort of glorifying the Copts as really being, you know, the descendants of the pharaohs, and this was part of a sort of divide and conquer angle that they were looking in a way to magnify through this genetic study. Whereas when you look at what the Egyptian doctors are doing, because for them, the distance between, you know, the moment of like collecting the blood and then analyzing it, for them, it's not this serious disruption so much of the blood, like traveling overseas, losing, you know, all context except for the label. You know, these are soldiers that they might be seeing on a regular basis. So I think as you highlight this question of disruption, the disembodiment of the blood, it happens through different processes. And that I think is something that interested me a lot when I was writing this book. So thank you for raising it.
I want to jump in and ask a question that's a kind of follow-up, and that's the ethical imperative of some sort to give back to the communities from which the blood was drawn. So do the scientists have any sort of a sense of giving back either, you know, medically or returning the knowledge they have produced, in the sense that they're informing the populations in languages that they may read or hear, or in some way that they communicated the findings of the research? I mean, is there that kind of ethical consciousness by the scientist, and then the ethical action?
Sometimes, yes, there is, but it's very uneven. So we can actually think about this question about which kinds of communities did scientists feel they had ethical obligations to, and which ones did they feel like it was okay to just sort of parachute back out and never, you know, never sustain any relationships with. So, for example, when I was talking again about the example of Bathsheba Bonet, again, she was one of those people who claimed that she was observing, you know, sort of a higher level of ethical engagement. She made a point of saying that whenever she took blood samples, did the lab results, that she would give these results back. In many cases, this was just sharing with them the knowledge of their own blood types, for example. In the case of James Bowman, he was also another researcher who felt, or at least, you know, repeatedly claimed that he felt a strong ethical obligation. In this case, it makes more sense because Bowman was specifically involved in studying this genetic disease of favism. So to test people for favism and then not share with them the results, I mean, obviously that would have had even a higher sort of ethical implication, but he was very invested in sharing, you know, with everyone he tested their results. So trying to use the information to empower them medically, even as he then did sort of use this knowledge to try to make anthropological claims within the scientific sphere. He felt that within his medical practice, yes, it was ethically important for him to ensure that the communities had this knowledge. So there's a lot of sort of unevenness. In general, it depended a lot on whether, I think, the scientists were embedded in specific communities. So you can say that James Bowman, for example, okay, technically he's not an Iranian scientist, he's a foreigner, but he was embedded and working within Iran for many years. He had very close Iranian friends, so he considered himself to be sort of part of a local community. That's very different from some of the other examples of genetic researchers who got funding for, again, what we would call sort of parachute field trips, where they would just show up in a community for a few weeks, you know, try to very extractive trips, right? So the idea was that you would just get all of the blood samples you could, you'd leave, and these people likely would never hear from you again. So there were different sort of lines along the sort of ethical spectrum that different scientists were adhering to.
Thank you. Tamara?
Yes, the second question is from Yanis. Could you please comment on the growing number of Turks tracing their non-Turkish lineages, mostly Greek, but also Assyrian and Armenian? And can you comment on the growing identity conflict between the Kemalists and the Neo-Ottomans, like Erdogan, who promote an American ethnic model of Turkey?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question. And this is something that I think started increasing when I was already almost done with the book. So this phenomenon, I think, actually is a result of the release of certain kinds of, I think, old Ottoman like census data. And so not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily start out from a position of trying to trace genetic genealogies, but more traditional attempts to trace genealogy and to kind of recover ethnic erasures in people's own genealogies. So the cases in which Armenians, Greeks, and so on, in many kinds of, you know, really horrific situations facing violence or expulsion, were sort of forced to take on Turkish identities or record themselves as ethnically Turkish in different kinds of documentation. I think that now in certain sectors of Turkish society, there's this kind of fashion, I think, to try to recover one sort of hidden ethnicity in a way that I don't think is too conceptually different from the way that people who are white are trying to recover other kinds of identities through the use of various really genealogical methods, including genetics. So obviously the one that's been most recently very well publicized is the problem of Native American identities being claimed by people who are otherwise, in every important sense of the word, white Americans. It also sometimes happens where people, especially, well, this is, I think, especially symptomatic of the genetics turn, is the claim of people to find unknown Jewish ancestry in their genealogies, and to think that this somehow dramatically shifts their identities in certain ways. You know, in some cases, this might make them more sympathetically inclined towards Zionism or something like that, or to feel that they have a claim to historical Jewish victimhood. So I think we can see parallels to what's going on in Turkey now and other kinds of phenomena in different parts of the world. So it's an interesting question.
Well, if I could just add, I think the closest parallel is Black Americans using DNA genetic ancestry testing to find their roots in Africa and different African tribes. And it's a very similar claim that our histories have been erased by enslavement. And that's why these technologies are so important. So it's not so much white people trying to claim an identity that they never had, but, or shouldn't be entitled to. But I think it's a more sympathetic claim of people whose histories were erased by oppression and therefore see these as ways of reconstructing the past. And of course, Henry Louis Gates and his very popular PBS series emphasizes that. And this is something that Alondra Nelson talks about in her book, Social Life of DNA, but also relates to the question I was asking about, is this empowering, or does it just reinforce these racialized concepts of human difference and unity? That really, again, your book brings up so many important questions in this context that I think many of us haven't thought about before, the Middle East.
You're right. And thank you, Dorothy. Actually, I agree with you. That's actually a much better parallel to the phenomenon that we were just discussing. I think you're right in the sense that in the cases we're seeing in Turkey, it is definitely more of, I think, an effort to be a sympathetic claim, as you say, to recover, lost paths. Yes, I like that much better. So thank you.
Okay, the third question is, in the last few decades, to what extent have race, religion, genetic research been driven by the critical demands of the experimental method?
Okay, I'm not 100% sure that I really understand this question, because I think the demand of the experimental method is not something new to the last few decades. I mean, what I mean to say here is that when I'm talking about the longer history of this genetic research, this racial classification studies, they all thought that they were doing experimental, empirically driven research. So I guess I'm not exactly sure what the distinction is that's being drawn about the last few decades.
Can I comment quickly?
Sure.
Well, I was the person who asked that question.
Okay, please, yes, clarify.
Yeah, in 1975, when I got my PhD, we were very, very powerfully driven by defining variables such as Jewish identity. And I did a whole PhD dissertation on just that. And as I listen to you, I'm hearing this whole discussion about the scientific community working with these variables that don't seem to be defined. And is there something lost in the rigor of defining variables that allows the scientific community to talk about race or religious groups without really knowing what they're talking about? Am I missing something?
No, I mean, actually, I think you're getting on something important when you're talking about the question of variables and what actually is the scientific community doing, and what do they think they're doing that allows them to have a conversation. So I think something that's really important that I try to center, at least in the middle of the book, is that there's a lot of debates going on about the meaning of these potential racial markers. Okay, so the scientists are definitely not unified in what they believe about the evolution of certain genetic traits, whether they are sort of a result or of ancestry, whether they're indicative of racial origins or evolution, or whether they're the product of other kinds of evolutionary processes. And to talk about the question of how undefined variables are somehow still popping up. I mean, so I'm actually writing an article now about the development of genetic distance calculations, admixture calculations in the 1970s, and specifically the attempt to use Jewish populations as sort of a model system to test new kinds of statistical calculations of genetic admixture. And there was actually a ferocious debate between these scientists, even though they're using the same sort of sample data, arguing about which calculation creates the more sort of statistically valid result. And the variable that they cannot agree on ultimately is how much Jewish admixture they should have anticipated in order to judge which method is more correct. So you have one camp who, based on historical evidence, again, so not the genetic data set itself, they're saying, well, we should have expected a result from this data set that would indicate very low admixture. Therefore, the method that generates that result is going to be the one that's probably more correct, and we should use it for other systems. And then you have another camp that's behind the other calculation method, which again is relying on, a different set of historical research saying, like, actually, we expect in these Jewish populations to see really high rates of admixture. So this other method of calculating, in our view, is the correct one. So you have variables being defined on the basis of different kinds of information or sort of irreconcilable information. And so the scientists don't always arrive at a consensus, right? So I imagine that you would have seen this in your own research, that no matter how carefully you define your own variables, you're going to find some other scientist or research group, whatever, that disagrees with you on some basis about what your variable definition was, about which statistical method you used, and so on. So this is the kind of thing that scientists still, right, argue about all the time.
So we have 2 more questions that Tamara's going to read out, and then I think unless we'll finish, have the 2 questions, and then if Dorothy or Eve have any last words too, we'd like to before we leave. So.
Okay, so the first question is from Julia, and she's looking at the construction of a pan-Arab identity promoted by Egypt in the 1930s. In particular, she's focusing on a conference organized at Cairo for the formalization of an Arab music. And at that conference, many European music scholars were invited to assess this Arab musical identity, and some of them were German Jewish. So she's trying to understand what, on the one hand, was the attitude these Jewish scholars might have had to an Arab identity. Did they feel linked by Semitic origins or not? And on the other hand, the attitude that the German Nazi had toward Arab identities, Semitic and thus associated to the Jewish, or part of Germany's Orientalist fascination. And the second question is from Sigil, and she's asking a question about Aksoy. Any evidence accessible about his background?
Okay. So to address the first question, so this is complicated. Okay, so you have on the one hand the German Jewish refugees, mainly academics of all kinds. So I talked specifically about physicians and genetic scientists, but there were a lot of German Jewish academics who were historians, psychologists, sociologists, so on, who are expelled from Germany. And they end up getting academic positions in different parts of the Middle East and so on. I don't know that I've seen evidence of any sort of unified German, specifically German Jewish attitude toward Arab identity. I think it actually depended a lot on where they ended up working. So those who ended up working at the University of Istanbul and were working mostly with Turks, I think we're not that interested in this question or in the idea of sort of forging a shared Semitic identity. I don't see evidence necessarily of that. So for some of the physicians, German Jewish physicians who ended up in Iraq, for example, so some of the first, the Ashkenazi Jews who studied Favism in Iraq, they actually tended to notice, I think, the distinction between Iraqi Jewish communities being sort of isolated, or, not completely isolated, that's not the right word, but having different kinds of medical problems from other parts of Baghdadi society, for example. So I'm not trying to speak definitively. I personally, in the research I did, I didn't see strong evidence of attempts to create a unified Semitic identity on the part of that specific professional group. Likewise, with the Nazi Germans were extremely ambivalent about the status of Arabs and Turks and Iranians, whether they counted as Aryans for the purpose of German racial laws or not. And they never really fully resolved this right up until 1945. So on the one hand, you definitely had like German sort of Nazi propaganda, which was usually trying to speak in terms of Islam, actually, less so in terms of any kind of alleged racial kinship. So that's just scratching the surface on that question. I'm sorry, but and then to get to Sechil's question. Okay, so the question about Aksoy's own background and whether or not he might be from a minority community, that's possible. Again, that's something that I did not encounter at all in any of the autobiographical information that I came across from Aksoy, which admittedly is fairly piecemeal. There was a biography written about him. There was an oral history, undated oral history I found in Milikutupane, which had no metadata. I have no idea who collected this history or why they asked certain questions. But as far as I know, he identified solely as Turkish, as being part of that majoritarian community. So if he did have any other kinds of sort of minority origins, then he was either unaware or deliberately concealed any such ancestry.
So Elise, thank you so much. You've given us a great book and a great discussion. And I wanted to thank our other participants. I wanted to thank Eve, Troutt Powell, and Professor Dorothy Roberts as well for launching us in this wonderful discussion. Just thank you all for coming. And we had a great turnout and beginning of a great discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you all so
Thank
much
you,
for the great
everybody.
questions.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, bye. Are you gonna stay on, Beth?
I think we,
Elise, that was awesome.
thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much,
I'm so
Elise.
glad. Do I need to stay on for any debriefing or just the two of you?
No,
Okay.
no, just go rest. Have a
All
drink
right, thank you.
on
Thank
us.
you.
That was
Thank
great.
you. This was great. And I'll look forward. The papers are so great for this workshop. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So actually,
Should we leave and come back?
for me?
Let's leave and come back. Come back onto mine.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll find yours. Exactly. Okay. All right.
Bye.
I'll close this one. I'll end it.